Discoveries like this are just pushing the envelope of what we know about ancient humans, and this discovery is certainly one of the big ones.
They found handprints and drawings that are between 35,000 and 40,000 years old. At a minimum, they could be even older.
For 40,000 years, no human being was supposed to enter this cave. It was completely sealed by rock, ice, and time, untouched since the last ice age. No explorers, no ancient tribes, no archaeologists, just darkness, waiting. But recently, a team of researchers finally broke through the stone barrier and opened the entrance. What they expected to find was simple: prehistoric bones, maybe primitive tools, the usual traces of early humans. What they actually found shocked the entire scientific world. The moment the first lights illuminated the cave walls, researchers realized this wasn't an ordinary Ice Age shelter. The chambers stretched deeper than anyone expected, and inside were objects so perfectly preserved that it felt like the people who left them had just walked away yesterday. But the deeper the team explored, the stranger the discovery became, because hidden in the darkest chamber of the cave was something no one believed could exist 40,000 years ago, something that challenges everything we thought we knew about early human civilization. Some scientists are now calling it one of the most mysterious discoveries ever made. And before we reveal what researchers found inside this ancient sealed cave, make sure you hit like and subscribe, because some people believe this discovery was never meant to be opened. The cave at the edge of the world. To understand just how massive this discovery really is, we need to start at the place where it all began. A dramatic limestone cliff at the very southern tip of Europe, where the Mediterranean Sea meets the Atlantic. This is Gibraltar. Carved into its ancient rock face is a network of 4 interconnected caves known as the Gorham's Cave Complex, a UNESCO World Heritage Site whose floors hold 120,000 years of continuous human habitation. 120,000 years. That's more than twice the entire lifespan of modern civilization as we know it. Professor Clive Finlayson, one of the world's leading authorities on Neanderthal behavior, spent 9 grueling years excavating the deepest reaches of one of those caves, Vanguard Cave. 9 years, bucket by bucket, centimeter by centimeter, in the suffocating darkness of a narrowing limestone passage. And then one day, the shovels hit something that made everyone in that tunnel go completely still. It wasn't collapsed rock. It was a dense plug of ancient, compacted sand, perfectly sealed, undisturbed since before the extinction of the last Neanderthals on Earth. Not a single grain had moved in 40,000 years. When that sand was finally removed, what lay behind it stopped every breath in the room, a world frozen in time. Behind that wall of sand was a 13-meter chamber, roughly 42 feet deep, carved high into the cave roof. It had been hermetically sealed from the outside world for at least 40,000 years. No light, no air, no moisture, no living creature had been inside since the Pleistocene. What that kind of isolation does to the contents of a space is almost impossible to overstate. When oxygen and moisture are cut off completely, things don't rot, things don't crumble, things stay, looking almost exactly the way they looked on the last day someone was in there. The pollen inside the chamber was still intact, preserved so precisely that scientists could identify which plants were blooming outside the cave on the exact day the sand sealed it shut. Organic plant material, undisturbed sediment layers, objects arranged exactly where they had been left, not scattered by time, not disturbed by nature, positioned, waiting. How many times in your life are you going to find something that nobody's been into for 40,000 years? Professor Finlayson told reporters. It only comes once in your lifetime. And what was waiting for them in that perfect, untouched preservation was something that should not have been there at all. The object that changed everything. The first things the team found were bones. Specifically, the bones of apex predators, lynx, spotted hyena, and griffon vulture, all gathered inside this sealed, elevated chamber deep within a cliff face. These animals don't naturally share space. They don't lair together. They had no natural reason to end up in the same sealed room. Someone brought them there. The walls bore deep scratch marks gouged into the limestone. The work of a carnivore that had been trapped alive inside this room and had never got out. But among those predator bones and haunting claw marks, the team found something that stopped everyone cold, something small, something utterly out of place, a single whelk, a large edible sea snail, sitting quietly at the very back of the chamber, roughly 20 meters from the nearest beach. Whelks don't climb, they don't travel, they don't wander into sealed mountain chambers on their own. Someone carried it there, and given the age of this cave, 40,000 years at minimum, that someone could only have been a Neanderthal. Somebody took that whelk in there over 40,000 years ago, Professor Finlayson said. Those people, because of the age, can only be Neanderthals. A Neanderthal deliberately picked up a food item from the beach, walked it into the darkness of a cave, and placed it at the back of a sealed chamber. That is not instinct. That is not random. That is a conscious, planned decision made by a thinking being, one who understood storage, preservation, and deliberate use of a hidden space. And that single, quiet, unremarkable sea snail just demolished an entire century of scientific assumptions. The myth that crumbled, for the better part of 100 years, Neanderthals were depicted as the B team of early humanity, dim-witted, brutish, barely capable of complex thought. Smarter modern humans arrived from Africa around 40,000 years ago. The slow Neanderthals couldn't compete. They faded out. End of chapter. That story was repeated in classrooms and encyclopedias until it became gospel. And Gorham's Cave has been systematically dismantling it for decades because the whelk is not the most extraordinary thing found at this site. Not even close. Buried in the layers beneath the sealed chamber, archaeologists found a 60,000-year-old purpose-built hearth, circular, with 2 channels and a thick-lined wall, engineered by Neanderthals to produce plant tar for adhesive 60,000 years ago, a controlled manufacturing process for industrial glue. This wasn't a campfire. This was a structure where plant fragments could be heated without exposure to open air, a process called pyrolysis that extracts sticky resin only under precisely controlled thermal conditions. In practical terms, an oxygen-controlled kiln, 60,000 years before the first pottery was ever fired anywhere on Earth. And they hadn't copied this from elsewhere. They adapted it entirely to their local environment, using gum rock rose, a Mediterranean shrub, instead of the birch bark used by Neanderthals in colder climates. They identified local resources, experimented, and built their own version of a complex chemical process from scratch. That is chemistry. That is materials science. The language hidden in the fire. But here's the implication that rarely makes the headlines, and it may be the most profound of all. A process like controlled pyrolysis cannot be discovered by accident. You don't stumble upon the knowledge that certain plants, heated at precise temperatures without open-air exposure, yield a resin strong enough to bond stone to wood. Someone had to figure it out first, then teach it to someone else. Then the next generation had to teach it again, and the next. That requires language, or something so functionally close to language that the distinction becomes meaningless. It requires teaching. A culture sophisticated enough to preserve technical knowledge across lifetimes and carry it into the future. The foundational architecture of civilization itself. The only reason we know any of this today is a geological accident, a fast-moving sand dune that sealed the site at the exact moment of burial, trapping pollen, spores, and a frozen snapshot of an entire culture's knowledge at the precise moment it was about to vanish forever. Without that accident, this evidence would be lost, and the textbook story about Neanderthals would still be the one everyone believed. Masters of a lost world. Zoom out even further, and the full picture is breathtaking. The cave floors are layered with mussel shells and bones from fish, monk seals, and dolphins, all bearing cut marks from stone tools. The Neanderthals of Gibraltar weren't scavenging. They were actively harvesting marine life and processing it in organized domestic routines. Evidence shows they also collected bird feathers for personal decoration, a behavior the entire framework of human evolution had reserved exclusively for modern humans. And the world they surveyed from that cave entrance looked nothing like today's coastline. During the last ice age, sea levels were dramatically lower, and the cave mouth opened onto a vast plain stretching 4.5 kilometers into what is now the Mediterranean. Dunes, pine woodland, freshwater lakes, and wildlife so rich, researchers have compared it to the Serengeti. This was their paradise, and they had mastered every corner of it. Then, generation by generation, the sea rose. The dunes vanished. The freshwater lakes filled with salt. Their world drowned in slow motion over thousands of years. And still, the Neanderthals adapted. Still, they came back. Still, they endured. 54 strokes that changed everything. And now we come to the discovery at the absolute center of this story. The thing the intro promised, hidden in the darkest chamber, that no one believed could exist 40,000 years ago. Deep inside Gorham's Cave, carved into the bedrock itself, researchers found an engraving, a deeply impressed cross-hatching pattern cut into the stone floor more than 39,000 years ago. Published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, it was confirmed as the first verified example of abstract art created by Neanderthals. The team spent years ruling out every possible natural explanation, conducting experimental replication studies under controlled conditions, testing every known process that could produce similar grooves in limestone. The conclusion was unambiguous. The lines were made by repeatedly passing a stone tool through the same grooves, a minimum of 54 separate, deliberate strokes, in a sustained act of creation that served no practical function whatsoever. 54 strokes. Someone sat here 39,000 years ago and chose to make a pattern, not to sharpen a blade, not to process an animal, just to make a mark that existed for its own sake. Is it art? Is it a doodle? I don't know, Professor Finlayson said, but it is clearly an abstract design, at a time when there were no modern humans near Gibraltar. For generations, the capacity for abstract thought was considered the defining cognitive line between Homo sapiens and every other species. It was our proof of intelligence, the justification for our survival, the one thing that made us categorically different. With 54 deliberate strokes on a cave floor in Gibraltar, that line was erased, the last one standing. We've long been told Neanderthals went extinct around 40,000 years ago, but the evidence from Gorham's Cave tells a different story. Artifacts here suggest Neanderthal populations at Gibraltar may have survived until somewhere between 33,000 and 24,000 years ago, up to 16,000 years after their supposed extinction date. 16,000 years. The entire span of recorded human civilization fits inside a window smaller than that gap. That places the last Neanderthals alive here, in Gibraltar. At precisely the same time, our ancestors were building complex societies across Europe, possibly within visual range of each other, separated only by the Strait of Gibraltar, which is narrow enough to see across on a clear day. Two species of human, simultaneously, possibly aware of each other across a strip of water. What happened in those final thousands of years, contact, conflict, interbreeding, or simply displacement as the last hunting grounds drowned, remains one of the most haunting unanswered questions in all of human history. But whatever ended the Neanderthals of Gibraltar happened while they were still carving, still manufacturing, still teaching their children. They did not fade quietly. They endured. Why some believe it was never meant to be opened. Which brings us back to the question the intro raised, the one that doesn't get nearly enough attention. Why do some people say this cave was never meant to be opened? It comes from two serious directions. The first is scientific. Some researchers argued the chamber should never be fully excavated. The perfect preservation existed precisely because it had never been opened. The moment you break the seal, you introduce oxygen and humidity. Pollen degrades. Organic material breaks down. The conditions that made the find extraordinary are destroyed in the act of discovering it. Some archaeologists argued the responsible approach was to leave the bulk of the site sealed for future generations with better tools. But the second reason runs deeper, and it's the one that has quietly unsettled parts of the scientific community since the findings were published. This cave, once opened, forced a question no one was fully prepared to face. If Neanderthals had language, culture, chemistry, symbolic thought, and organized domestic life, if they were doing all of this tens of thousands of years before us, then what exactly is the story we've been telling about ourselves? For generations, the superiority of Homo sapiens over every other human species wasn't just a scientific position. It was foundational to how we understood our place in the world. We survived because we were smarter, because we deserved to, because evolution itself chose us. Gorham's Cave doesn't just challenge that story, it dismantles it, one artifact at a time. Because if we were wrong about Neanderthals for 100 years, if we looked at the evidence and saw exactly what we wanted to see, then the question isn't just what happened to them. The question is, what else are we wrong about? That is the discovery that was never supposed to be made. Not the whelk, not the kiln, not even the engraving. It's the mirror this cave holds up to us. And what looks back from the other side. The door is open. The sealed chamber is now open. Its contents are being catalogued one carefully labeled fragment at a time. And Professor Finlayson has been clear about what lies ahead. As we dig, he said, it's only going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. Beneath the chamber floor lies a continuous record of Neanderthal life stretching back tens of thousands of additional years. They believe they've barely scratched the surface. Every bucket of sediment screened through the grid could contain the next piece of evidence that forces yet another rewrite of human history. Symbolic thought, chemical manufacturing, marine harvesting, composite tool construction, feather decoration, abstract art, organized domestic life. All of it, from a species the textbooks called too primitive to compete with us. The species that made those marks, carried that shellfish, built that kiln, and then vanished from the earth, has been waiting 40,000 years for someone to come looking. Now that the door is finally open, what comes next may be the most important chapter in the story of who we really are. So here is the question I want to leave you with. If Neanderthals were capable of all of this, chemistry, symbolic thought, marine harvesting, composite tool manufacturing, organized domestic life, abstract art, and a culture that transmitted knowledge across generations, then what exactly did Homo sapiens have that they didn't? What was the actual difference? Because after everything this cave has revealed, science does not have a clean answer. Whatever finally silenced the last Neanderthals on these cliffs, after they survived longer than any of their kind, built kilns, harvested the ocean, decorated themselves with feathers, and carved abstract meaning into stone, while their world drowned slowly around them. It was not because they lacked anything that made us human. Perhaps that is exactly why some people believe this cave was never meant to be opened, because once the door is open, you can never unknow what's on the other side. Drop your theory in the comments. Subscribe, because these excavations are far from over, and the next discovery from behind that wall of sand could rewrite the story all over again.